Welcome to A View from Belhaven, North Carolina. Today we're going to be covering the Fed, which is much in the news right now. The Fed has a dual mandate, basically maximum employment and stable prices. And those two things can work in conflict with each other. If you try to stimulate the economy too much, you can get full employment, but then wages do not keep up with prices and inflation, and therefore the workers are actually worse off than they were before. And the Fed has the tools in its tool belt in order to work with this, and the biggest one is the interest rate or the overnight rate that they control. And so it's currently set at 4.25 to 4.5, but whenever they make a decision to change that rate, it takes between 3 and 18 months to work out in the economy. So the things highlighted in red, you can see that credit cards and auto loans and short-term things like that can move fairly quickly, 3 to 6 months, but mortgage rates and business loans and other things that impact the larger economy take longer to accomplish. And so now we're going to get into what they should be looking at versus what they do look at. And so looking forward, the things that I see on the horizon is that AI is going to be replacing jobs over the long term. Remember, jobs is the first mandate of the Fed. Secondly, fiscal policy, in other words, what the Trump administration is doing, has changed, and we'll look at the specifics of that, but it's basically making government smaller, both on the employment side and on the spending side. And then we'll get into tariffs, which I did a previous video on, and I pulled one slide out of it. And then finally, looking at backwards data, we're going to look at the current inflation report and then the yield curve. So starting with AI. AI is replacing jobs already. Challenger, Gray, and Christmas came out with a report that said that AI has replaced 10,000 jobs in the first 7 months of 2025. And I don't think that included the 9,000 jobs that Microsoft laid off based on their restructuring program, which had much to do with AI. So I asked Google to do a search for me, and this is what it came up with. The companies to the left are people that have already laid off employees, and the companies on the right are looking at laying off employees simply because of AI. Now, in 2024, there's $235 billion spent on AI, and that's expected to grow to $631 billion by 2028. So as I look forward at the horizon, I see jobs being replaced by AI that need to be made up somewhere else. And we don't know where that would come from, but we do know that by lowering interest rates, you would spur business activity and possibly provide jobs there. So the next one we'll be looking at is fiscal policy changes. And Doge was in the news in the last quarter, and out of that uh, policy change, there was 154,000 federal employees that took the deferred resignation, which meant that they would still get paid up through the end of September, but starting October 1st, they would not be paid anymore. So that's going to be 154,000 people that, if they haven't found jobs already, are going to be looking for jobs starting October 1. Second, we had the Big Beautiful Bill Act, which reduced federal spending by 1.7 trillion over the 10-year period, and we expect another reconciliation bill starting in October based on announcements already made that should further cut spending in the future. And finally, they did the Rescissions Act of 2025, where they clawed back 9.4 billion of already allocated funds. So that in my mind, this is saying that the federal government has changed its policy and will not be spending as much as it has in the past, which will affect the employment. Finally, we get the tariffs, and this did come out of my previous video. I will link it. And there was pros and cons to the tariffs. And one of the cons is that you could get a one-time higher price on some products especially if we don't have a domestic market that is manufacturing that at this time. And so that one-time price can be mitigated with lower energy costs and regulatory costs, which we've already seen taking place, but also interest rates. So if, say, car prices go up by $3,000 or $4,000 because of tariffs, a lower interest rate could make the payment still come out to be approximately the same over time. So if the Fed is worried about the tariffs causing inflation, one of the things that they can use to fight it is lower interest rates. Finally, we start looking backward data. In June, they released the CPI, which is 2.7%. It was over the 2% mandate that the Fed is, or target that the Fed has announced. But the largest contributor to that, which was 40% of the whole index, was shelter, and shelter rose 3.8%, and it has nothing to do with tariffs or any other policy other than interest rates. And then we looked at the very bottom line of that, and its car insurance increased at 6.1% year over year. Again, that has nothing to do with tariffs. It has to do with more to do with interest rates. Finally, we'll talk about the yield curve. The 10-year to the 2-year yield inversion has been a predictor of recessions in the past. And the 10-year to 2-year inverted in July of 2022 and uninverted in October of last year. Now, when it uninverts, usually within the next 24 months, we go into a recession. And that's a structural thing that goes on in the economy. So based on just that information alone, we could be looking at a recession, but right now it's less likely than it was in the past. But again, lower interest rates at the front end of the curve, which is currently inverted by the Fed's policy, would help us get to an uninverted curve. And so right now, to uninvert this curve, you would need a 3.6% overnight rate, and that would be a 60 basis point reduction in the current rate, at least, just to get the yield curve to uninvert the rest of the way at the front end of the curve. Finally, I do want to go in a little bit of the too late criticism that Trump calls Powell too late, and this historic look at the inflation rate versus the Fed fund rate will explain that. So in the blue is the inflation rate based on CPI that is announced each quarter. And then in the orange is the Fed's fund rate. And you can see in Trump's first term, along about 2019, Chairman Powell was increasing interest rates, claiming that tariffs was going to cause inflation. The inflation never did come. And eventually COVID hit, and they reduced interest rates going into COVID. Then the Biden administration was elected in 2020, took office in 2021, and they had the American Rescue Plan, which added $1.9 trillion that went directly to consumers, and then added later that year the $1.2 trillion Infrastructure Investment Act, and a lot of that went to corporations in America. So you had an almost doubling of fiscal spending during that 1 year alone, and Powell failed to recognize that additional spending would create inflation, while almost everybody else in the world did recognize it. So this is where you get the too late. You can see that he was 5 quarters behind as the inflation rate rose almost to 9%. That he was way behind on raising the interest rates in order to curb that inflation. He eventually did top out and then started reducing interest rates right before the election. And this is where Trump has been the most vocal about those inflation rates should have kept coming down. And in this case is one case where I do agree that the interest rate should have come down, and we should be at least at a 3.6 and probably lower than 3 right now, and 3 being around the long-term interest rate place that we want to be. And so this is where we get to the bottom line. In my mind, the Fed is driving our economic future by looking out the back of the car. They're looking at historic data, CPI, and other information that's already happened, and are not looking down the road at what will be, um, in 3 to 6 to 18 months when they actually make a rate change and it takes effect. And so in this case, they're not just too late. They're actually a bureaucracy that is using the wrong tools in order to provide policy decisions. And so we do agree that the Fed should be independent from the executive, but there should also be accountability. This Fed has been wrong on everything except COVID, and COVID was basically a no-brainer. Everybody knew that interest rates had to go to zero for that. And so the big question going forward is, how do we get a Fed that's accountable to their decisions without being just a simple mouthpiece for the executive? And that's where I'd like for you to give me some of your insights and how you think this can get pulled out of the political field and put into a field where good policy making is done by an open and accountable method. I'm looking forward to hearing your comments. Thanks.